Are very nearly live. Sorry for the lack of Eurovision playlist. I was playing Netta to my children this morning and they were doing an amazing chicken dance around the kitchen. Hello everybody and welcome to our session of the morning with Jim Dickinson of Wonky. I'm sure you all know what an invaluable resource. Sorry for the lack of Eurovision playlist. I was playing Netta to my children this morning. Oh, we got a refurb link. Hang on. Hello everybody and welcome to our session of the morning with Jim Dickinson of Wonky. I'm sure you all know. There we go. Apologies, everybody. Wonky, where was I? Wonky SU, what an invaluable resource it's been to us all. If you are not signed up, then why not? The briefings and support that Wonky provide us all have been absolutely fantastic over the last year. Joining us is Jim, formerly of NUS and Student Unions, and now working at Wonky. He will give us a dust off his crystal ball and with 100% accuracy, let us know what is going to happen over the next year in the world of higher education policy, how it affects student unions, and what that means to the meetings we have, the relationships that we have, and how that will influence our campaigning. So massive thank you to Jim. During the meeting, please use the question and answer function to post any questions you might have, and I will post those to Jim at the end of his session. Over to you, Jim.
Thank you, John. Thank you for the invite. Really pleased to be here this morning. Terrific event, this, and kudos to everyone that's kind of pulled it together over the past couple of weeks. Really good to see this kind of collaboration and networking and so on occurring in the teeth of a pandemic. Good, yes. So as John says, I'm going to look at some of the issues and agendas that are likely to impact students and students' unions in the year ahead. And just to say, this is going to be an attempt at, although it's not, you can't avoid it, an attempt at a kind of COVID-19 secure session. So there will be no COVID-19 here, although of course there will be, but I'm not going to talk about COVID-19. In fact, I'm going to talk about COVID-19 in a separate session a little bit later, I think 1:30 this afternoon. If someone could confirm that it is at 1:30 in the chat box, that would be really handy. There's a non-target reference here, so there probably aren't many people on the call that will understand the reference of the picture in the bottom right-hand corner. One of the things that characterizes thinking about higher education, that's right, Bobby Ewing, thinking about higher education policy in the year ahead, is that there's a really, really big American soap opera drama that in the 80s, the BBC was importing to the UK, and it was getting 20 million viewers an episode at one point. It's called Dallas, about oil barons in the US, and one of the characters in it was Bobby Ewing here, Bobby. And in its later series, most agreed that the plots were getting a little bit outlandish and very, very hard to believe. And at one point, the scriptwriters determined that rather than finishing off all of the kind of cliffhangers from the previous series and resolving them, they instead would open the series with one of the central characters, Bobby Ewing here, waking up in the shower and declaring that he dreamt all of the plot of the last series. Now, I'm not suggesting that at some point we're all going to kind of wake up from the bad nightmare of COVID-19. But I mean, it's certainly the case that a lot of policy agendas in higher education have effectively been put on pause by the pandemic and are likely to kind of re-emerge, if not completely intact, then certainly, looking moderately similar to where they were last year. And one of the things that therefore makes this session very interesting is that if by chance you happen to have been at an event or, some sort of conference or whatever this time last year, where I was doing, looking ahead to the higher education policy year ahead, you will recognize lots of the content because we have effectively, as I say, paused a lot of things, whilst we, kind of handle the pandemic. So, certainly if I've kind of come across you before, don't be surprised if you recognize some of the contents and the analysis here. That's kind of necessary for those of you that are kind of jumping on the moving bus. The other thing to say just before I start is, and I say this a lot, certainly for those of you that are student officers and for those of you that provide direct support for student officers, representing students and winning for students and doing all those things that we try to do for students, is a really interesting process. And I think it's interesting because everyone is invited to write a manifesto and make manifesto commitments. And everyone, to some extent, is invited to develop plans at roughly this time of year. People go away on residentials and so on and write their plans for the year in terms of what they want to achieve. But the reality is, if you follow lots of student officers on Facebook and Instagram and so on, when they get to the end of the year, you see that lots of the wins and the things that people are proud of aren't necessarily the things that they planned to work on at the start of the year. And I call the difference between these two things hunting and fishing. So the bit where you are, analysing the university or the world or the student experience and then setting out to very deliberately change it against your, kind of analysis that you've put to the student body, I'd call that hunting. And then the bit where you're responding to opportunities and threats and events and reviews and initiatives and, things that happen, I'd call that fishing. You're sort of waiting, big fish comes along, and then you have to move quite quickly and have your wits about you. And I think that is it, that split in where you should kind of spend your prep time and what you should do and so on has become really, really heightened by the pandemic. Because to some extent, what the pandemic did, of course, was wipe off the ability for lots of student officers and lots of student unions to advance their, long held objectives, either in manifestos or in policy terms, and so on. The other thing, and by the way, sessions like this are really about preparing you for that kind of fishing thing. So predicting the big fish that will come along so that you're able to kind of, respond quickly. The other thing I put on here is I do not look, I maintain that I don't look anything like Dominic Cummings, although there's a kind of weird group of people on Twitter that say that I do. But you'll have seen that ridiculous outfit he was wearing at the weekend. I've put a picture of him up because this isn't a session that's about planning, but in Cummings style, this is a session that's about forecasting and the difference between forecasting and planning, and therefore, working out what to do once you have your forecast is broadly where this session seeks to be. Although I'm certainly not suggesting that you should adopt the tactics and methodology of Dominic Cummings more generally. Now, so the year we've had, this time last year, as I say, delivered versions of this session to various audiences. And I think it's fair to say that lots of people had grand plans around all sorts of interesting things. There was already a packed agenda, but then three things happened that knocked all of that out. First, a general election. And I can't underestimate how all-encompassing for lots of student unions the general election was, because there was a sense that various people were conspiring through the date of the election to prevent students from voting. And so a massive amount of effort and time and campaign budget and so on was spent on, getting the vote out for and getting students registered to vote in the general election. And one of the things about that is that if we're going to learn from that, we should probably at some point make sure that student unions haven't got to spend as much time at the next election getting students registered to vote. We should probably spend a bit of time fixing the roof while the sun is shining, sort of, even though there's a pandemic on, but making sure that efforts are made to more automatically register students to vote, either through induction processes or, whatever that might be, so that we don't have this problem when the next general election comes around, because it really was heartbreaking to see student union, officers and staff that support them having to devote so much time to getting students registered to vote rather than actually campaigning on the issues that were, that surrounded the election itself. So, allocating a chunk of capacity, time, whatever, to trying to fix that problem of student voter registration in more meaningful ways than we were able to in the teeth of a general election last autumn seems to me to be a smart idea. Second then, of course, was UCU surprised lots of observers, I think, by, for the first time in many years, calling a chunk of industrial action to kick in the first term. And that was the first time in years and years, apart from the odd one-day strike, that UCU had called action in the first term. And certainly, for those universities that were affected, again, that takes up a disproportionate amount of time in terms of student concern and democratic structures to resolve the union's position on a dispute and so on, and so on. And again, thinking through and maintaining the relationship with UCU, partly because of where UCU might go next in relation to the pandemic. I'll talk about that at half one. Seems to me to also to be really, really important thing to do as a result of what happened last year. And then, of course, the pandemic. And as I say, what I think all three of those big agendas did was wipe away almost all prospect of lots of student officers being able to advance their agenda. And it just goes to show, I think, the extent to which being prepared to respond to the things that you don't predict or don't want to happen, just how important that is, as well as putting the time in on, your kind of plans and objectives and so on. Hopefully, what will happen in the year ahead is that some of the things that we are forecasting will happen relate to some of the things that are in student officer manifestos, strategic plans, and the kind of objectives that people are setting in their virtual away days. And I guess the nice bit is where you can hunt and fish at the same time, if you like, and we'll kind of see, I guess, whether that's likely to happen as we advance through these slides. I'm going to tell a little story for about 5-10 minutes that I have told a number of times. So this is time to get a cup of tea if you've kind of seen these slides before. And it really relates to where we are politically, I think, the kind of macro politics of where Britain is at this point. It remains the case that Britain is split. It is still to this day, if you look at the polling, broadly split on leave or remain lines, and a set of attitudes, social attitudes that fall off the back of that. And, you can still broadly divide the country into two kind of camps in this way. And as you can see, depending on whether you voted leave or remain, has a significant impact on the likelihood of you supporting concepts like multiculturalism, social liberalism, feminism, the Green Movement, and so on. What I'd say about that split is that traditionally in British politics, universities have tended to enjoy the support of both sides of the House of Commons, by which I mean, right-wing people and left-wing people have generally supported universities. Most of the expansion of English higher education has happened under Tory governments, for example, rather than Labour governments, and so on and so on. And you can get a story about tuition fees with broadly the same content onto the front page of both The Guardian and The Mail. What is very interesting about this political phase we are in is that people that are on, if you like, the kind of left-hand side of this graph, the kind of leave people, don't like all of the things that universities have come to represent: multiculturalism, social liberalism, feminism, green movement, globalization, technology, and so on. Okay. And if we are in a period now where for the first time the major split in British politics means that not only do a significant proportion of the population not believe in universities and their expansion, but also, in theory, that side won the last election, we are in uncharted territory. And this isn't territory that vice-chancellors or Universities UK, this isn't territory that people have come across before, okay? And that makes the next 2 or 3 years very, very, very unpredictable, very interesting, potentially quite worrying for universities, for students, and so on and so on. And we see aspects and shards of this play out in micro ways, sort of day to day. And certainly those of you that were on Twitter on Friday when you saw the details of the Westminster government's proposed bailout package for universities in terms of loans, you'll have seen little shards and aspects of this kind of wider, leave remain culture war play out even in a fairly technical document about entitlement to loan funding for struggling universities. Part of what's going on here is a bit of kind of, onion peeling. And what I mean by that is there are lots of people, I think, that have a broad understanding of what left and right means, what leave and remain means, what the two sides of the House of Commons means. When you scratch a bit, of course, and remove a layer from the onion, what you find is that inside political parties, there are much more complex power games and structures going on. And, to oversimplify the sort of next layer of the onion, one of the things that you could say, at least until very recently, is that there were two types of conservative. There's the kind of classic Tory right, old-fashioned, socially illiberal, pro-Brexit. And then there were the sort of centrists, the Cameroons, the generally pro-industry, internationalist in approach, Remainer, generally socially liberal. But one of the things that started to emerge out of the back of Cameron was a sense of a new group trying to kind of come through the middle of those two traditional conservative positions. And they were variously referred to as all sorts of things, but one of the things they were referred to was Erdington modernisers. And this character is characterised by Theresa May talking about families that just about manage, the jams, a sense that there needed to be a focus on nationhood, and lots of ideas that were stolen from this really interesting book by an author called David Goodhart. Well worth a read. I don't agree with almost any word of it, but it's an absolutely fascinating read, called The Road to Somewhere, which tries to differentiate between citizens and young people in particular that either believe themselves to be citizens of somewhere or nowhere, and citizens of nowhere are people who've been to university and believe themselves to be kind of global globetrotters and so on, and then citizens of somewhere rooted in their communities, very focused on nationhood and so on and so on, and a big debate about immigration going on inside that. And I guess the chief Erdington moderniser was this guy called Nick Timothy. Nick Timothy was Theresa May's chief of staff when she was at the Home Office developing the hostile environment. And Nick Timothy, in a Telegraph article about 3 or 4 years ago now, said these things. And what's fascinating about these things is they could have been said last Friday. Okay. So although lots of things feel new, and certainly, those of you that are subscribers to Wonky SUs will get updates every day about the latest new thing, lots of these things aren't really as new as they look. And Nick Timothy had done some of these things about too many graduates working in non-graduate jobs that we heard Gavin Williamson say not a week ago. Certain degree subjects offer no return on investment. Again, we heard Michelle Donnellan say that not 2 weeks ago. Tuition fees were supposed to make university funding fairer for the taxpayer, but more than 3/4 of graduates will never pay back their debts. Again, both Michelle Donnellan and Gavin Williamson have talked in the past couple of weeks about the extent to which tuition fee subsidies represent value for money for the taxpayer. So, all of this written in the Telegraph 3 or 4 years ago, and kind of foreshadowed, lots of the stuff that we are talking about now. And one of the interesting things in the Telegraph article is that Timothy quotes a woman called Alison Wolf, who'd argued that sub-degree technical qualifications can have high labour market value and contribute to productivity growth. If you've read that bailout package on Friday, you will see that one of the conditions for universities being able to access that bailout loan package is that it strongly considers whether it can convert degree programs, the full 3-year degree, into qualifications that can be packed into something that stops at level 4 or level 5, the equivalent of year 1 on year 2 of an undergraduate degree. So look, Friday felt new to see it written down. Nick Timothy saying it 4 years ago, quoting Alison Wolf, so on and so on. Yeah. Now, all of that led to a guy called Philip Augar being asked to carry out a review of post-18 fees and funding. If you're new, you'll have heard a lot already about the Augar review. And what's interesting about the Augar review is that Philip Augar carried out this review a couple of 3 years ago, delivered it over a year ago. It was late when it got delivered, and it's been sat on ministers' desks since. And we're not going to get a response now to the Augar review until the winter. And to some extent, what happened on Friday in that bailout package foreshadows what we're expecting to see in that response to the Augar review from the government. But to give you just some macro stuff that's going on, first is this. So This is the English undergraduate fee system. That first column on the left is the split between graduate and government pre-2011. So as you can see, government was putting in about 2/3, graduates were putting in about 1/3. The column in the middle is the split between graduate and government post-2011, when fees were tripled. As you can see, what happens there is that's basically the two proportions swap. By then, graduates are putting in 2/3, and government is putting in 1/3. And then you end up with the system since the middle of 2017, the system we have now, which has brought it closer to 50-50. And just to explain what happens there is, partly as a result of responding to these concerns about tuition fees, Theresa May turns up to a Tory party conference and announces that she's going to move the graduate repayment threshold. This is the amount you have to earn before you start paying back your tuition fee loans. It's going to shift it up to give people in their 20s more disposable income. And that has a pretty fundamental effect, as you can see, on the split between graduates and government. And it's fairly true to say that there are lots of people in government who've looked at that split and thought, that's a lot of money for one day's worth of headlines in the press. And of course, it wasn't a day's worth of headlines in the press, because if you remember that speech, it's the speech where Theresa May lost her voice and the letters fell down behind her. So she got no headlines out of it. Probably not much benefit in terms of people in their 20s voting Conservative, but it cost the Treasury a lot of money. And the amount that the overall fee system in England costs the Treasury really, really matters for all sorts of obvious reasons, because it's a lot of money. Part of the reason it matters so much is this graph. This is another one from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. You've got various lines here that show you how much different types of education cost per student. And, you know, two things to say about this. First is because there have been an increasing number of children working their way through the primary and secondary school system throughout the last decade, the amount spent per student has been under real pressure. And that's why those lines have either plateaued or gone down that are below the top one. The line at the top is fascinating, right? That's the amount we spend per higher education student. And that's been going up because the government said, you know, you can charge up to £9,000. The government assumed that every university on average would charge 7,500. But actually what happened is that every university charged the max for all sorts of different reasons to be covered in a different webinar on a different day. And so the system has cost more than everyone expected. And that's resulted in us as a society spending more per student than the government ever intended. Now, you can argue, those of you that are, you know, recently students or people that work in universities, that, you know, even that hasn't been enough. Certainly been under pressure over the past few years because of the kind of squeeze on the, you know, flattening of £9,250 as a limit. But nevertheless, it's significantly more than government intended back at the start of the decade. Coupled to all of that then is a series of moral panics. So a surge in unconditional offers that has largely resulted in, largely came about because universities have been very, very keen to recruit students. Intense competition between universities, no caps on the number of people that universities can recruit. So lots of, you know, big moral panic about unconditional offers. Similar moral panic about grade inflation. Here's the grade inflation chart. Grade inflation in the news today. So universities have voluntarily agreed to take measures to try to cap and, you know, deal with grade inflation. But grade inflation also a significant concern. That's the proportion of students that get first or a 2-1. These are the top 20, by the way, if you're not sure on whether you're at a university that is the worst offender, as the Daily Mail would say. I would say the worst offence about this particular graphic from the Mail is that is actually a picture of some school children going to choir rather than students, but that's a different issue for a different day. Vice-Chancellor pay is almost never out of the news and has been, you know, a big concern and a major moral panic for, you know, lots of people over the past few years. And so, you know, I have to take some notice of that. And also then advertising. So the accuracy of advertising has become, a real concern for people, and the way in which people advertise. You might have seen a story last week about incentives, iPads and bursaries being offered to students. You might predict that when students realise how little face-to-face teaching they're going to get in September, we're due another one of these moral panics about advertising later in the summer. There are certainly lots of concern last year and the year before about clearing and, clearing apps on Tinder and, the way in which celebrity footballers were recruiting students to universities. All of that intense competition around grade inflation and conditional offers and sales tactics, and this sense that governing bodies have got to pay a lot of money to get a vice chancellor that can cope with these large numbers, come out the back of this demographic dip that there's been. This is the number of 18-year-olds knocking around to be recruited. We're kind of at the bottom of that right now, as you can see on that graph. It's about to tick back up for 10 years. But that has meant really intense competition between universities, and that was before COVID-19, that has generated the sort of place where we are. What's fascinating, though, is what happens in the next 10 years. So you could look at that graph and think, blimey, there's going to be a lot of demand for university in the next 10 years, and that is true. But there's even more than that graph suggests, and that's partly because the biggest determinant of whether or not you apply to university is whether your mum went. And at the appropriate time, X number of years ago, there was this large expansion of women into higher education that now will accelerate that demand even faster than the birth rate acceleration might suggest. So there is real pressure on going to university, getting higher education, university places in the next 10 years. And as a result, it's perhaps not surprising that the government, looking at the eye-watering cost of sending someone to university, leaving home, going to another city, 9,250 quid in fees, maintenance costs, and so on, in a recession that's likely to mean students pay back less of that loan, it's perhaps not a surprise that government is thinking, can we persuade people to take other options that are perhaps cheaper for the exchequer and that have more of a direct relationship to the labour market? Now, we can have a really long debate in another session about whether or not the tactics to then achieve that are the right thing and whether or not those objectives are the right objectives. But you can understand, I think, why there is significant concern inside government about the idea that, trying to persuade people to aspire to something other than the traditional 3-year university degree where people leave home and so on over the next 10 years, given some of those pressures that are generated by population spikes and, as I say, the number of women that go into HE. The other story of the Augar review is the lack of money that we spend on further education and crucially, the lack of money that we spend on people who don't go into university. For all sorts of reasons, that has been significantly depressed over the past 10 years. And that generated in the Augar review a bunch of things that now are sort of slowly playing out in government policy. So to give you an example, Gavin Williamson's letter and proposals on higher technical education a couple of weeks ago talked about the idea that students might in the future be able to take single modules of higher education at level 4 and 5, often in further education colleges, technical in nature, and they might be able to get fee loans and maintenance loans at modular level rather than entire course level. Yeah, so these sorts of proposals are slowly sort of coming true, even if there hasn't been a comprehensive response to the Augar review. Augar also said that the average per student resource for universities should be frozen, and fees have been frozen again next year. That the teaching grant should be adjusted to reflect a subject's reasonable costs. And we got some weird balloons being floated by Boris Johnson in the Telegraph at the weekend about whether or not we might end up with variable fees or at least variable amounts going to universities per student. And Augar also recommended changes to the measures of student disadvantage to capture individual level socioeconomic disadvantage. And again, we've had Michelle Donnellan floating interesting balloons in that space over the past couple of weeks, where some people have said, oh my God, Michelle Donnellan is going to abolish targets for poorer students to get to university. But maybe, her and her advisors have read these chapters in the Augar review and are floating balloons, getting ready to kind of implement them later in the year. Now, here's there's a really interesting line in the Augar review that says, unless the higher education sector has moved to address the problem of recruitment to courses which have poor retention poor graduate employability, and poor long-term earnings benefits by 2022-23, the government should intervene. This intervention should take the form of a contextualised minimum entry threshold, a selective numbers cap, or a combination of both. That is fascinating because if you look at Michelle Donnellan's speech from a couple of weeks ago, Higher Education Minister, she talked about for too long the higher education sector misleading students by enrolling them onto courses that have, guess what, poor retention and poor employment outcomes. Almost exactly the same thing that Augar said was a concern, in June 2019, the date I've put on the screen there. So, the Augar review and the ideas in it and what that might do to higher education really, really does matter for the year ahead in England. The other thing I'd say about all of that, by the way, is related to all of this, given we've got a population spike in the next decade, is how much we spend per student. This is a really interesting graph. This is a graph that shows you, took a photo of this in a lecture, the amount that we spend per student in different countries. So you've got, competitor countries like Australia, Canada, France, and so on here. USA, the only country that spends more than us per student. The most interesting thing about this is who was presenting the lecture. A woman called Alison Wolf, who's come up in the story earlier on. The daughter of her daughter was one of the authors of the Conservative Manifesto. Until recently, Alison herself was inside number 10, advising on skills policy. She's on record as saying that in her view, the unit of resource, that's the amount that universities get to spend per student in the UK, is too high. There's too much focus on higher education to the expense of further education. And she was one of the authors of the Augar review. So you can see how all the pieces fit, right? Lots of these ideas are not new. They're forecastable, if not necessarily predictable, to pick up something, that I was talking about earlier. And again, go back to that Nick Timothy thing. Lots of Alison Wolf's, stated views about higher education, given she's just been inside number 10 advising on skills policy, are well worth a look. Won't go into these in detail. What I would say is they're manifesting themselves now in speeches, but policy balloons being floated, policy papers and so on, coming both from Gavin Williamson, the Secretary of State for Education, and Michelle Donnellan, the Universities Minister. Now, coupled with all of that, I won't play that video again, because some people have seen it 10 times this summer. Coupled with all of that are moral panics around students as snowflakes, grade inflation, as I've talked about, and, in the end, for the wider Conservative Party, once you have half of young people leaving home, enrolling in what are called in the press poor value for money left-wing madrasas, and that's what people have called higher education in the past in the press, you have only really got two options. You either cause less people to do it, or you spend less on those that do it. And actually, probably you do a little bit of both. And so what we're going into in the next year is a year where, again, the best forecast is at the absolute macro level, the government is going to want to spend less per student in higher education, and is going to want less people to be doing the sort of higher education that we understand as higher education to be at undergraduate level, 3 years, often away from home, the sort of traditional undergraduate and so on. Now, it might force some people by having number caps. It might incentivize some people by changing prices and having other incentives. It might make apprenticeships really brilliant to do. It might, make it really difficult to leave home and go to university. It might have number caps at some universities and so on. But what we can predict is we're entering a year where student choice at 18, which is students choosing a university and a degree course, as long as a university lets them in, will be deprioritized. And these two things will get prioritized. The government spending less on each person that ends up in that place, and the government wanting less people to do that more generally, for all of the reasons that I've kind of talked about earlier. And into that environment, discounting COVID, you then end up with kind of 10 big issues that are broadly affected by that kind of macro issue. And I'll rattle through these at some pace now. First is culture wars. So for those of you that are new, the debate around students and freedom of speech and culture wars has been going on forever, and I could do a separate webinar on culture wars. But what I would say is there are some big issues still around that generally culture wars issues amongst students get debunked fairly quickly. But there are a couple that are lingering around. So one is on religious freedoms. There is a significant number around the country of question marks around religious freedoms and where students' union policies might rub up against the views of some particular student groups. And the most obvious over the past year has been pro-life activists and pro-life groups seeking to run campaigns or run societies and so on that have fallen out with student unions and their democratic structures, and that's going to continue, I think. There will also be a continued concern around what still is called a trans debate. Certainly for me, it's the idea that you would debate someone's existence is bizarre, but the right-wing press is really, really obsessed with this kind of set of issues around trans and trans identity and so on, in a way, again, that could do a completely separate webinar on. And then on Friday, you saw this dig at niche activism and students' unions. And what I'd say about that is that it may just be a throwaway line, something to wind the press up with. It might be the opening salvo in a major attack on students' unions to come in the winter. We don't know yet. Student movement's going to want to think about its tactics and whether or not it pokes the bear unnecessarily. The student movement is definitely going to want to think about being ready to prove its value if it needs to, because the response to the Augar review might contain echoes of the sorts of things that we saw this last Friday on niche activism and student unions. Second, then, is that big response to Augar. So this is due in the winter alongside the comprehensive spending review. Headlines are a close look at these low value courses, and that is very much defined as the ones that or at least the subjects in universities that have got poor graduate outcomes, poor non-continuation rates. By the way, continuation rates are going to be really important as a result this autumn, and I'll come on to why in a moment. There will be a desire to shift the amount the state puts in, potential caps on numbers, potential changes to pricing, some extra bits of ideology, as we saw on Friday, and potential changes to widening access policy. This is really complicated stuff, but I think the ultimate moral question for students' unions will be: there was a moment when the Augar review was published, and the proposal was to cut fees to 7,500, but that would have meant potentially a cut in the amount of money going into universities. And there are really interesting questions for student unions that don't like student debt about whether to support a cut to the debt of 7,500 a year rather than 9,250, or whether to oppose it because it would have cut the amount of money going into universities. And this is complicated, this fees debate. It's easy if you're debating fees or not in a kind of NUS conference way. It's really complicated when you get to some of the ways in which the government might seek to fiddle about with the repayment mechanisms, the overall fee level, the amount the government puts in as opposed to what the student puts in, and so on and so on. And so, getting ready for that debate by immersing in it and understanding its parameters, I think, is a really wise thing to do in that sort of fishing space rather than the hunting space for the year ahead. Third issue is non-continuation. Now, for reasons that I talked about in relation to low-value courses, non-continuation is going to be massive this autumn, and this is where a little bit of COVID-19 infects the session. First of all, we don't know who dropped out over the past few months, and we probably need to know because it won't be uniform in terms of student characteristics. But there's a massive concern starting to be generated around the edges of the working groups and so on COVID around how we're going to keep students till December if they can't make any friendships and they can't exist on campus and so on and so on. And there will be a lot of interaction with students' unions on understanding why students might be thinking about dropping out and so on. And the key question I'd ask here is, do universities know why students might be about to drop out? And does the student movement know why students might be about to drop out? And what can students' unions do to be better, to be in a space where they do understand why students might be thinking about dropping out? How can students' unions develop the capacity, to get a rapid understanding of what needs to be done to prevent, mass dropout, or even what can be done that might cause students' unions to conclude that dropping out isn't negative, and that you know, a deferral, if people don't like the first 2 weeks of next term, is a very smart thing to do. And you know, wait till a vaccine and so on. So this whole issue of non-continuation, I suspect, becomes quite important for students' union officers and staff that support them to develop capacity and expertise around as we get to September. Fourth is mental health. So mental health has not gone away, and continues to be a kind of major concern of the sector. And, you know, one of the things that kind of got paused really was a major piece of kind of delivery work in the mental health space being run by the charity Student Minds. And after kind of 10, 15 years of trying to understand the issue of student mental health, we had started to move more to a sort of, you know, less research, more delivery. Get the strategies written, get the investment done, and so on. And that's to some extent outlined in the Student Minds Mental Health Charter. If you've not seen it and you're kind of campaigning around mental health, had mental health in your manifesto or whatever, it's well worth a read. It's, you know, good piece of work, generally well regarded around the sector. And the assumption before the pandemic was that every university would sign up to be a part of the Student Minds Mental Health Charter. I don't think anything in the pandemic causes anyone to believe that that's not still the case. And so, you know, students' unions will have an opportunity, I think, in the year ahead to interact with their university around some of the issues that manifest in the Charter, but also crucially to interact on turning the things in the Charter into actual things that will happen on campuses. Some of the issues around the edge, just to say, are things like where the line is between the NHS and the university in terms of kind of treatment and support, what the responsibility of academics should be in this space, the standard of and regulation of university-run services, waiting times, so on and so on, culturally competent delivery and strategy in the mental health space. This is, you know, for really good reasons. For example, in lots of the Black Lives Matter work, lots of Black and minority ethnic students would argue that the service delivery on mental health isn't culturally competent around their identity and life experiences and so on. And then also student loneliness. And I know that lots of people have student loneliness and so on in their manifestos. Certainly we did some work on student loneliness last year that it's worth looking up on wonky.com. And the role that students' unions play, obviously, in trying to mitigate against student loneliness and improve social networking and so on, really, really important in the year ahead. The question, of course, is whether there's the money and the capacity to make some of the Student Minds recommendations a reality in the year ahead, but we shall see. Then the review of the TEF and the baselines. Now, again, I could run a separate webinar on a separate day about the teaching excellence framework and have for our subscribers. But just to say about TEF and baselines, the TEF, the teaching excellence framework, the thing that universities get, bronze, silver, gold, and so on, contains some student input in two ways, through NSS metrics, through, you know, taking some scores from the NSS, and by having some student voices on panels. The TEF has been reviewed. That review was completed well over a year ago. Again, another review sat on ministers' desks. No one really knows whether the TEF will survive and whether, as mooted by ministers, it will start to manifest at subject level. Certainly one of the proposals was that in a given university, you might have 10 different TEF ratings, some bronze, some silver, some gold. The question in the year ahead really is, will universities, if there's a part of the university that doesn't look like it's performing well on the TEF metrics, either improve that provision or drop that provision? And obviously, dropping that provision can have serious impacts for students in terms of being able to complete their studies. And even if there's a commitment to teach out that provision, whether or not academics stay around, what the experience is like, and so on. So it's always been the case with all of these sorts of metrics type, you know, ways of running public services, that if you're running a provider of a, you know, a school or a hospital or whatever, and you've got poor scores on your cataract operations, you can either drop doing cataracts or you can improve doing cataracts. And there is this residual question constantly in universities. The more granular the metrics get, the more the question is whether or not universities might drop some of their provision. And that's the thing to keep a good eye on, I think, if you're a student union stat type person in the year ahead and thinking about where pressure might come to make changes and or quietly drop provision. Related to that is the National Student Survey. We were due, obviously, the NSS was, big NSS results day last week. We were due a massive review of the NSS. There are endless debates about whether the NSS should focus on the academic experience or the broader experience. There's a debate on about whether or not it should be extended to PGT students, not PGI yet, but PGT. There's a pilot, again, the results of which are sat on OFS's desk. And also whether or not the NSS should be extended to first and second years. We're due a review of the questions, partly to make sure they're fit for purpose. The example I give on Twitter a lot is that the top 25 performers on question 26, the Students' Union question, 24 of them don't have a Students' Union. So whether question 26 can survive a sort of refresh of the questions is interesting. How they're presented, what's done with the results, whether we need more capacity on understanding what works. So, assessment and feedback hasn't improved much in the past couple of years, even though it comes out as a poor score each year nationally. And there will be interesting questions again for Students' Unions in terms of the extent to which Students' Unions are interested in shaping a better survey, or interested in just trying to get the survey killed off or sidelined or whatever. But there will certainly be lots of opportunities, I think, for Students' Unions to feed into what is billed as a major review of the National Student Survey, how it gets used, who it gets asked, the questions that it focuses on, and so on in the year ahead. Number 7 is Scotland and Wales. If you're in higher education in England, it's very tempting, I think, to ignore what's going on in Scotland and Wales. But I mean, we will certainly cover what's happening in Scotland and Wales in as best we can on the site. And there are some fascinating things happening. There is a real debate now in Scotland starting to spark up about whether or not the position for home students maintaining free education will hold. My personal view is it will hold for longer than many are predicting, but that doesn't mean that we won't see shifts in student maintenance and finance that are worth keeping an eye on. There's a new tertiary education bill in Wales that we covered on the site last week that has got some really interesting content about student protection and student engagement that are worth keeping an eye on. On Friday in England, student union officers were getting a kick from the Westminster government. Last Wednesday in Wales, student voice was getting a big boost in the form of student engagement codes. So worth keeping an eye on what happens on that stuff. There have been some fascinating interventions during the pandemic on student housing. Scotland appears to be a nation prepared to act in the interests of student renters in a way that might be irresistible for the rest of the UK once it catches on. And there are, interesting things, for example, been happening around period poverty, both in Scotland and Wales. And so I guess what I'd say is students' unions that maintain their links with and draw parallels between England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland will be well placed to attempt to influence what might or might not happen in Westminster in the year ahead. And then 3 others. One is on contracts and consumers. One of the things we might predict is that if it's the case that universities have been overselling blended learning, and what that will feel like in September, that in August and September and October, there may be a series of what are branded as mis-selling scandals around, the advertising that universities and the reassurance that universities have made over the past couple of months. And students' unions are going to want to ask themselves whether they want to be a part of that or adjacent to that, or very much to the side of that in terms of what students' unions have been doing, participating in and offering in relation in particular to Freshers' Week and social activity. But more broadly, as each week ticks on, more pressure comes from students on students' unions to act and to advise on their rights as consumers. And we saw that with a record number of student signatures on petitions for refunds in the early part of the pandemic. And it will continue, I suspect, into the new year in relation to what students have been told they can expect in relation to next academic year and what they're actually going to get. And there are strategic questions, for trustee boards, if nothing else, about whether and the extent to which students' unions should move to be central players in these debates around student consumer rights, in particular in terms of how they advise individuals. A couple more. Harassment is going to be a major issue this year, particularly in England, because there is a consultation on preventing it and dealing with cases of it that has been paused by the Office for Students, that can't be paused for much longer. And this will generate, significant amounts of activity in terms of reviewing policies involving students and so on and so on. Again, won't go into that in too much detail, but certainly if you've got commitments around some of those types of things in manifestos, this will be a year to interact with that agenda when it restarts as soon as OFS causes it to. And because the standards are pretty clear in the proposed document from OFS, it's almost inevitable that some of those expectations and standards will work their way around the rest of the United Kingdom in terms of nations. Clearly, students' unions are going to want to make sure that universities have the capacity to get some of the questions in that right, but that's going to happen in the year ahead. And then finally, on Brexit and international students, there's this lingering question about involvement in programs that generate science funding, Erasmus Plus, and student exchange. Whether EU students will still apply to come to the UK after this September, certainly after the new year. In theory, you've got an end to the hostile environment and initiatives like a post-study work visa, but you can see in the press today major hostilities with China that some people think will affect recruitment from China. And more generally, students' unions are probably going to want to look again at representing international students locally and nationally in terms of making sure that those issues are feeding through, particularly some of the immigration issues. But Brexit and international students certainly isn't going to go away this year. And then I've tacked a cheeky one on the end. And I've tacked it on the end because it's really important. Lots of people, I think, looked at Black Lives Matter over the past couple of months and saw universities respond and make promises. And I've worried that it's being regarded as a moment rather than a catalyst for real change. And this is a residual question. We're running a blog on this later in the week. Universities UK work on Black Lives Matter and changing structures will happen in the autumn. There's a really interesting pamphlet from HEPI on Thursday on decolonising the university. And there's, certainly a sense from some people that if we can pivot to online this fast, we should be able to make deep and wide change on race and racism in universities. But there's another sense from others that this might be a bunch of broken promises and an issue that fades under the complexity of COVID-19 and the summer holidays. And students' unions are really central, I think, in continuing to place the pressure on and demonstrating that they're putting their own house in order in relation to racism, structural racism, and Black Lives Matter. And so, again, if you're fairly new to some of this and how this has played out in universities, plenty of resources on the site from us and from others to have a look at and worth thinking about in terms of where that agenda is in your meetings and decisions over the summer. And that, with 2 minutes to go, is that, as ever. Happy to take questions, John, but I suspect we're out of time. And of course, I'll make the slides available for delegates as soon as I get a chance.
I think let's do a couple of questions, as we've got one, I think, quite timely. It's about the DFA guidance on universities who need financial support. They said that if you were the Vice Chancellor of a university entering dire financial straits with all those conditions, would you accept the government's emergency help?
No, I mean, look, you would have to be in really, really severe trouble to be diving for that as a package. You'd phone your lender first, wouldn't you? You'd phone the bank. You'd do a lot of things before you went there. That's not to say that there won't be 2 or 3 providers that are in the approved fee cap category that might end up in that space, that might have to take advantage of it. As I say, I think the thing that's more interesting about the package is what it signals about more general drifts in higher education policy in relation to October and November and what we might see in the response to the Augar review. You don't go to the trouble of writing all that stuff in a document that is very broad and only applies to 4 or 5 providers that might be in real financial trouble now, if you haven't at the back of your mind got this is the big direction of travel for the autumn. So the more insidious thing would be a vice chancellor chatting to the students' union about their block grant, looking at the democratic review that a students' union has just done, saying, are you sure you need 6 SABs? Maybe you only need 5, thinking that they might need in their back pocket to be able to say to DFE at some point in the winter, I persuaded the union to go from 6 SABs to 5. Do you know what I mean? It's that insidious stuff about the mood music being sent out and how universities might respond that we just need to keep an eye on, I think, between now and the autumn.
And on that note, we saw in the last green paper before the Augar report that when there was a question about student unions, that generally the sector was incredibly positive. We had loads of support from vice chancellors. It was all a bit quiet on Friday. I think we saw some good stuff from Royal Holloway, Worcester. Student minds were very supportive, but it was generally a bit quiet, wasn't it?
Yeah, and again, you know, if you ask most vice chancellors what sort of role has the Students' Union played in the pandemic, they would be very positive in the vast majority of cases. But it is pretty clear that we are going to have to ask, and we're going to have to get it minuted. We're going to have to, you know, do the deliberate things you have to do to get those things said, and then hold people to those positions if we need to in the autumn. You know, this is a time over the summer, as well as doing planning and coping with COVID planning and setting up for social events in September, to, you know, do all of the impact report stuff that people didn't get round to because someone was furloughed in, you know, May and June, to calculate up the impact of the union over the past 10 years in kind of welfare and volunteering and education and so on and so on. To do all that stuff, you know, also to do the lobbying of the university in terms of positivity, so that if required in the autumn, you know, people have got the kind of, you know, the material and the information they need to make the arguments they might need to make.
Jim, thank you so much. I'm aware we have more questions, but that is time, I'm afraid. I will feed the questions onto Jim, and maybe we'll put some feedback out on our Twitter account. Massive thank you to everyone who has attended. Jim, thanks once again.
No probs. See you soon.